Remind me of my ultimate end of speaking, Deborah. So
I can. We have some logistics to work on. Okay, she is to end at what time?
like about,
But we're taking questions.
so I'd say
about 11ish.
usually 11:05. Let's say 11:05.
Okay.
And what I'll do is I'll go like this.
Thank you.
You at 11, so that you've got a 5-minute warning, and then we're going to take questions. Teresa?
Yeah.
People don't generally bombard speakers with questions. Usually there's a couple.
So,
And I'll have the mic at the end.
and you'll
And run
have
around
that
with
for questions? Okay.
Yep.
So we're saying she's going to end at 5 minutes after for questions?
Maybe even 11:10. What? Maybe even 11:10.
Oh, because there aren't a lot
Yeah.
of questions?
Yeah.
Okay.
Whatever. That sounds
Don't
good.
worry, Bartlings aren't afraid to give questions
Okay.
too.
All right.
And I'm not afraid to get people to ask
And then you can
questions.
always go on, you can say, so she's a professor, so she can say, here are some of the questions that my students traditionally would ask.
Well, I've got questions within this, so a couple of questions. So I can
So who's
maybe
going
step.
to start? Are you starting?
Michael will start, and then I will follow.
Okay, I'm gonna make sure
And
this
then
is
I'll
turned
be
off.
introducing you. I'm just using your
Yeah.
bio and
I
talk information.
have somebody standing in for me today, and she got lost finding
Oh,
our
no.
classroom. I was like,
Because your campus is dizzying as ours is. Ours is small, but it's confusing. We make up for it in confusion.
Okay, wait, making sure. Yep. Okay. Putting that there to time myself, just in case.
All right. I think we're ready to go whenever.
All
You
right.
want to call our meeting to order?
I'll be quick, like 30 or 40 minutes, and then I'll hand it over to
that's good. I got 5 minutes.
You got
of
5?
I'm on
Okay,
set
all
just
right. Good morning. That's 4 of you. That's not bad. Good morning. It's good to see all of you today. Thank you so much for being here, and welcome to the annual Bartling Lecture. My name is Michael Tome. I serve here at CSP as the Chief Diversity Officer, and it's my pleasure to introduce to you and provide some background of today's lecture. Today's lecture is an outgrowth of a movement back in 2011 by Reverend Dr. Bartling's students and family to commemorate the 50th anniversary of Fred and his wife Ruth's arrival here at Concordia. The influence that Reverend Dr. Bartling has had on CSP is substantial. When he came to CSP, and as his teaching career of 40 years here would suggest, he expanded the curriculum to provide opportunities for CSP to be a pioneer and leader in the efforts to expand not only African American history curriculum on the history of the Vietnam War, curriculum on women's history, and also to start the MTEPS program, which allowed for the expansion of minorities in educational leadership. Truly a leader and pioneer in this area, and truly one of the reasons that we look out here even today and see the vast diversity that CSP enjoys, and not only here on our campus, but within our community. Reverend Dr. Bartling is here with us today, and I would like to take an opportunity to introduce and have us thank him for his work here at CSP. Next, Teresa Fitzpatrick, Chair of the Humanities Department, will introduce some scholarship winners as a part of the Bartling Lecture, and then introduce today's speaker. Teresa.
I'll just put her here. We are proud to announce both last year's recipient of the Fred and Ruth Bartling Scholarship and this year's recipient. This scholarship goes to a student each year who demonstrates excellence within the study of history, social studies education, or the humanities. We ask that both recipients come forward, and we will hold our applause until both are introduced. The 2023-24 recipient is Alexis Houston, our former student body president and member of our softball team, who graduated last spring from CSP with a double major in history and public policy and a minor in political science. Alexis credits her CSP education with equipping her for her current law school education at St. Thomas, plans to focus on criminal law, and hopes to one day become a prosecutor. The 2024-25 recipient is Brandon Saldana, a current junior at CSP from Cottage Grove, Minnesota, with a major in 5 through 12 social studies education. After graduating in 2025, Brandon plans to become a middle or high school social studies teacher. Please join me in congratulating these scholarship recipients. And now today's speaker. Dr. Kelly Sherman-Conroy is an accomplished Native theologian and storyteller, serving as an associate pastor at All Nations Indian Church and an assistant professor of religion at St. Olaf College. With 25 years of experience in ministry, Dr. Sherman-Conroy integrates indigenous theological perspectives and storytelling into Christian teachings and academic discussions. She is renowned for her work in indigenous theology, advocating for Native perspectives within contemporary contexts. In today's lecture, Dr. Sherman-Conroy will explore the profound ways in which contemporary experiences are shaped by historical narratives, focusing on the rich history of her family's Dakota Lakota history and wisdom. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kelly Sherman-Conroy.
Well, thank you. Bear with me. If anybody knows me well, I'm fairly accident prone, and rushing between classes a couple weeks back, I dislocated my ankle. So I'm going to be sitting today. So typically I would be all over the room. Thank you for the introduction. Congratulations. I think that's just absolutely amazing. And I've so far just really been enjoying meeting everyone this morning. As mentioned, my name is Dr. Kelly Sherman-Conroy. I come from the Oglala Lakota Sioux tribe, which is from Pine Ridge, South Dakota. So basically, drive all the way straight through South Dakota, which is a very long drive. Hit all the way to the west side, go down about 2 hours, and you run into the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. My Lakota name is Mato Washte Winyong, which means good bear woman. In my tribe, in my family, I'm a healer. And when I was little, my grandfather used to always say, when you grow up, you're going to be a healer. And I have to be really honest, I was really horrible at any kind of science. I get a little squeamish with blood, and I was thinking healer. That's what I was thinking. And speed up about 20 years. My mother and I helped start this ministry and church called Woyatan Lutheran Church, which was in Rapid City, South Dakota, focused on Native ministry to Native people. And a Native elder came in, and he was very traditional and often never really spoke to me, right? Not without an adult or someone present. But one day we found ourselves being the only ones in the church, and he came in, so I was fixing him something to eat, which is what we do, and getting him a sandwich and getting him something to drink, and we sat and we were talking. And then before he left, he stood up, shook my hand, and he said, Kelly, I know why you're going to be a healer. And I looked at him because I had not thought about this. This was a conversation only with my mother and my grandfather and my grandmother. And so it was, and by that point they had passed away, and it was not something we talked about. And I looked at him and he said, you're going to be a healer because you're going to bring more people to Christ. And I thought, oh, don't know what that is, because I also didn't want to become a pastor. So, and it took a long time to finally realize what he meant. But that still brought it into perspective in so many different ways. And it was because for me, for my understanding, for the history that I have always grown up with, was I didn't have a separation of one day I'm going to be Native American, right, Indigenous, and the other day I'm going to be a Christian. For us, for me, for my family, we grew up understanding that God was always present in our lives, right? That always present, that even before the missionaries came to this land, we were already living the stories that they were trying to teach us, right? That the stories of Christ, the teachings of Jesus and God, and they were always a part of us, right? That we were already living that kind of Christ-like life, that God was always present. So what my family always knew was that it wasn't the word of God, it wasn't the message that caused the harm to our people. It was the messengers. So for our family, it was very easy for us to become Christian, to be Christian, because for us, it was just an extension of our spiritual and our beliefs that we were already practicing. But for me, there were times when one day I had to shut it off. So I could never live in the world being fully who I was, because everything around me was trying to dictate a certain way of life, that I had to often find myself separating myself from who I truly was and my beliefs. And but then as much as I'm the most introverted person in the world, I decided to go to seminary. And when I did that, I began to find my voice. And with that, I began to understand my story. I began to understand my history of who I was and who I am, and the resilience, not just the difficult parts of history, right, that Indigenous people of this nation have experienced, but the resilience. And I gotta say, the women in my family, not gonna cuss, but we're pretty awesome. And my family women are so strong, and I just couldn't help but continue to walk in those footsteps by continuing to meet so many strong women in my life that have continued to mentor and just move me to who I am. But it is that understanding of story, right? So I want to introduce you to, who I am a little bit more. This is my son. He's a little bit older in this photo, but this is my son, Kieran. His Lakota name is Shungila, which means little red fox. Now he's kind of tall red fox because he's 12 years old and getting really tall. I am a single mom, but we say that he pretty much earned the PhD with me, because he comes to everything I do. And that's just a very traditional way of doing things regardless, is family is always important. This is my mother, Pastor Joanne. She is one of the first Native women in the ELCA, in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, where we are a part of. And she is actually my boss right now. She is the senior pastor at All Nations Indian Church, so we quietly argue behind the scenes all the time. But I've learned so much from her. This is my dad, Gerald. And my parents have been divorced, to be honest, the majority of my life. He is a Vietnam veteran. He is a retired banker. And now he and my stepmother live in Red Lodge, Montana, where her family has been for over 100 years, and they have a ranch out there. And my dad says now he can play cowboys and Indians all by himself. Both of my parents are from the Oglala Sioux tribe, so you're going to hear me say, I may say Sioux, I may say Lakota, I may say Dakota. Lakota, Dakota, those are just dialects, actually. So we are all part of the Sioux tribe in this area. Of course, what that you know is this area, this is the home to the Dakota people. This is our place of birth, right? This is where our creation story begins. And that's important. When we say who's indigenous to this land, it is the Dakota. But of course, then eventually we've had the Ojibwe and we've had other Native nations. I mean, the Twin Cities themselves, I think we said it was 92 different Native nations are represented in this urban area, which is such a beautiful thing. But when I say Dakota or Lakota, it's the dialect, it just tells us where we're from. Like we would understand, like if you heard somebody from, let's say, New York, right, and Texas, like you totally can understand the accents, or at least it gives you geographically. That's the same with us. But like I said, we're all a part of the Sioux Nation, but my parents, they grew up together, to be honest, and they're still really great friends and have modeled just a beautiful way of life for my family. And these are my siblings. My oldest brother, oldest is the key word here. He's here in the Twin Cities with me, and he's an indigenous chef. He actually, his nonprofit made the cookies that are over here, the Sun Butter cookies. He teaches about the importance of land and food sovereignty. He has a restaurant downtown called Awamini. If you get the opportunity to just try some indigenous food, it's really, really great. And on the other sides of me are my other siblings who are kind of mostly Montana based, but all doing something within kind of, we call Indian country, and just kind of elevating voice and story. And I wouldn't be me if I didn't mention my grandparents. So the first one, that little cutie in that picture is me. My grandmother, Alice, she was a teacher. She was an elementary school teacher. So I think the way I approach teaching in life, she was a big responsibility for that. The other two, which you'll hear a couple of stories from my grandfather, those are my mother's parents, Tom and Jeanette. My grandmother, Jeanette, in the kind of darker maroon in the bottom there, she is Santi Dakota, so that is my connection here. It is her grandparents, our grandparents that were here, and that is this family. So this is my family. They are Santi Dakota. The woman on the bottom right with the umbrella is my grandmother. She is my 3 times great grandmother. And next to her is her brother, Ehmani. They were a part of the Santi people. She was imprisoned at Fort Snelling, and I'll explain that in a little while, along with 1,700 of her people. And my uncle was one of the 300, along with my grandfather, who's not in that photo, who were imprisoned at Mankato and eventually exiled and moved to a different prison in Missouri for quite some time. And his wife, and next to her is I guess in more modern time terms, it would be our cousin, so the Dakota 38, which is a part of our history here, and the U.S.-Dakota War. Her husband was one of the 38 that were hung in Mankato. And to be honest, eventually they were Presbyterian. And I think it's important to note that, yes, there is a very hard history of indigenous people and Christianity. But a lot of what I do, and purposefully, is to bring a new narrative and healing narrative to that, so that people can see that God, of course, that we can tell our story, and we do not have to say, well, in the book of John, this is where you'll find it, right? That we can hear our story and hear God in that story and understand that for us, which I think for Indigenous people is really important as we kind of reclaim this spiritual sovereignty of who we are. And then finally, this is my grandfather. So my grandfather Tom here, this is his dad. He fought in the Battle of Little Bighorn. He was 18 in this picture, and if you look very, very closely, you are going to see a Niobrara cross. So most of our family became Episcopalian, which is why I always say I'm Lutepisc, little Lutheran, little Episcopalian. But when you hear my son talk about our family, The difference in an indigenous philosophy of how we speak is that separation of time and kind of space, and that there isn't that. So when I say grandfather, right, I may be talking about my grandfather here, right? My grandfather I've known, or my grandfather that I didn't have the opportunity to meet. Right? There isn't that separation. My son will tell these stories, and they will think, people think that he's met all these people, and he hasn't, right? But it's because of how we've learned about our story and how that's so ingrained in who we are, and that understanding of that connectedness of how we are connected to the world around us. And I think that's really important. So today, I'm going to start us off now with a bit of a story. And I want to kind of just bring you into a journey about how I have learned to, how I've just existed and how I have been taught to learn, right? That when I was young, there's always this understanding that the land, our ancestors and our stories were all just kind of woven together as one, right? And there was this way of these stories, and my ancestors and the people in my community, how they guided me through life, right? And they shaped who I am, and they taught how to live and walk in life in balance. But in this journey for me began kind of in the grasslands of what we call of South Dakota, just off the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, or just on the edge of it. My grandfather had a ranch, and we kind of all lived within that ranch in different places on this land. And they call it the Sand Hills because quite literally you had this beautiful, tall, kind of golden green grass and things like that, but underneath it, it pretty much was sand. You know, you couldn't really grow things. And indigenous people were often moved onto places where nobody else wanted, right? And so, but our family found a way to really thrive. And this journey for me was so important because often I would sit on the porch of my grandparents' home, and they had one of those kind of, it was all on the ground, but they had a white house, but it had a wraparound porch, or kind of just around one side of it, right? And they had an awning that you can sit under. And we would sit there, and you could just look out. And most of the time, like, I would either sit there during the day with like my grandparents or visitors, or at night, you would just sit and you could just hear the life, right? And the beauty of the land and the wisdom of the night sky. I mean, when I moved into a city, I really missed the stars because there was just so much that you could see. And I can still close my eyes and you could just feel like, you know, that cool air. Have you ever thought about like what it feels like to sit outside at night? And right now it's starting to get a little bit cooler, but that breeze just kind of touches you, right? And it just kind of settles in because the sun begins to kind of slip away, and there's such a beauty in that shift of night to, you know, of from day to night. And then you've got like where we were, they were, you know, the big tall grass, and you could just almost hear them swaying, you know, like the grass just kind of swaying, and you could smell the scent of the grass. And the sounds of like all the little night creatures, right? From the little frogs, so many frogs around my grandparents' house, to the little bugs and the crickets and all of that, right? You would just begin to hear life that just was awakening at night, and it would just kind of, this beautiful life would stir, right? And most nights, my grandfather often would start by sitting with me. And he would sit there and we would look up at these stars. And we would look at these stars and he'd start to tell stories. But my grandfather was a little different because his stories really unfolded slowly. Like in a span of 3 years, he told me one story. Like you know, like, okay, maybe not that slow for most of the stories, but it was that he never told me the full story. Right, that I had to find the journey myself within the story and hear what was needed to be heard, right? And kind of like the night, right? It was just how his stories just opened up. And sometimes, like I said, they just took forever. But it was like there was always this anxious moment of waiting for the next words, right? And these stories were more than just like the tales that we would hear or read in a book, right? They were lessons. They were sacred gifts that were passed down through generations, that he carried those memories and was passing those along. And they taught me a lot of patience, right? And how to wait for the ending. And how to let the wisdom of my ancestors really begin to settle deep within my heart. When I was young, I may not have gotten all that. But what I understand now was just what he was doing and how he taught me. And from my grandfather, I learned that the stars were more than just these distant lights, right? That they were our ancestors and they were watching over us. And they were guiding us with this kind of steady and quiet and beautiful glow. And each night, as he'd share a piece of our history or a piece of story, he would pause and then he would kind of tap me on the shoulder and he would smile and then he would just leave me alone. And I'd be sitting out there and I would just sit. And I am a person that just gets lost in my imagination. Don't know about you, but I'm often daydreaming, right? But it was just this listening and just thinking about the stories he would tell, and I could almost just feel it and imagine it and just experience it. And I would sit there under that sky. And those moments, they taught me that we are never alone, that our ancestors are always with us, that they speak to us through the land, they speak to us through the stars, they speak to us through our stories. And for me, growing up, that was really important because for a lot of indigenous people, right, the connection to the land, for us as the Sioux people, right, that connection runs deep. That this land, that Minnesota that we are on here, right, has always been sacred to the Dakota people. Every hill, every stream, every patch of earth holds the echoes of our ancestors. It holds the story, right? In Lakota, we say iya, which is this understanding of rock, right? And if you ever thought about the rocks, when we think about the creation of the land, the rocks have been through everything. That they hold the history, they hold the stories. So when we talk about why land is sacred for many reasons, that is a big one. That the land remembers our footsteps. It carries the stories of who came before, and it will carry the stories of all those people yet to come. It carries your stories. And to stand on this land where we are is to feel the weight of that history. To know that we are never alone, that we walk in the footsteps of all those people who lived, who struggled, but yet who thrived. Who thrived here for thousands upon thousands of years for where we are standing today, right? That in Lakota we say matakiweawasi, which means it's like a phrase, almost a breath prayer, and it means we are all related. There's an understanding that God, of course, for us, God is in everything. That often as human beings, we have a tendency to leave ourselves outside of the narrative of creation. Creation becomes the birds, the bees, the plants, right? The water, the sky, but not us. But if you take and you think about how we have been created, there's an understanding that God, that spirit of God is in and amongst absolutely everything. Those birds, those bees, the dog running across the street, the land that you're walking on, the grass, the air you breathe, all of that holds the spirit of God. And because of that, that is our connection to the world around us, right? That this breath prayer, this carries a profound meaning of and guidance in how we walk in this world. And for someone like me who is indigenous, nothing is disconnected from the web of life. So that means that every being, every rock, every plant Every part of this world is a part of our extended family. And we walk in relation then with everything. And it's because of that we have an understanding then that all around us is that living relative, right? That must be treated with respect. So when we talk about how Indigenous people kind of have this connection to creation, really we all do, right? We all have this connection that land is just not land, that it's almost like our mother, and she holds the story of our people, past and present, right? And so as I sit to you in front of you today as a Dakota, a Lakota woman, right? A descendant of those amazing people I just showed you, of my ancestors, of Little Crow, of all these leaders that we had in this area, right? In my family's history is steeped in both the trauma and the wisdom of the Dakota people here. And after the U.S.-Dakota War, right, my ancestors, they were forced into exile. And if you don't know a lot of land history, you won't realize that today that exile actually still stands. So if you look at the different 11 federally recognized tribes within the state of Minnesota, you'll notice that all tribes that are Sioux say community for a reason, right? That my grandmother, when she marched she was forced to march 150 miles to Fort Snelling, which was once the place, their birthplace, the place of creation where women would go to give birth. She was then imprisoned there with 1,700 of her people, mostly women and children and elderly. By the time they left, they were only 1,300. And then they were put onto the boats and they were exiled and they were moved to a place called Crow Creek in South Dakota, specifically made for the Santee people. And then eventually, after about 3 years of being there, they had people that were advocating for them, missionaries. And the missionaries they couldn't hunt because they couldn't leave the grounds. They were everybody was beginning to starve. They lost almost 300 children during that time. My grandmother, including, lost her kids, right? That they finally moved to a place called Santee, Nebraska, which is where they are today. And because of those amazing women in that village, in that family, they were able to recreate and rebuild their tribe. And eventually, once my uncle was released, he found his way back to his people, right? And it's that many of the people, the Dakota and the indigenous people in this area, they didn't survive. And those who did, they carried the weight of all this trauma with them over these generations. But the thing that I always learned was that we are survivors of survivors. That their resilience runs through our veins. It is the resilience that has allowed me to be able to endure. It is that blood that runs through our body. Like if you've ever thought about, one day I remember I was just really missing one of my grandmothers, and I just got really sad. And I was talking to my uncle, and he said, "Kelly, you realize that she's with you?" And I thought, she's with me in spirit, right? And he said, "No. You know, when you think about how we are created, we are so beautifully created. We are so intentionally created to be a part of community. When we are born, think about it. And we know that this earth is primarily made of water, right? We know that we are made of water. And then when we are forming within our mother's womb, we are immersed in that water. And it's been scientifically proven that water holds memory. So we then, those stories of our ancestors, those stories of our family are quite literally creating us. that blood that runs through my grandmother and my grandmother before her and so on and so forth quite literally built me. So that understanding that my grandmother was with me, it hit me in a whole different way with my uncle. And then just think about it, then we're born and that water flows back out into the world and your story becomes a part of something much bigger. And I have always found that such a beautiful, beautiful way of understanding how we're connected and that intentionality of community, that we have never, ever been created to be alone, that we are just so intricately connected to each other. And that is so important in this idea of this indigenous philosophy and understanding on the importance of our stories. All stories are important. And one of the stories that speaks of Badote, right, is this area where we are, is the place where those two waters meet, right, down by the river. And the waters of the Mississippi and the Minnesota, right, they converge down by Fort Snelling. And just as our people came together on this land, right, for the Dakota, Badote is just not that physical place of creation, but it's a spiritual place. It's a place where our ancestors continue to dwell, and it's where that kind of natural and the sacred intersect, where the land and the water and the sky, they meet to form the foundation of our very existence. It is where our stories here were then moved out and to be a part of the world around us. Because think about how that water flows, that rock flows with it, and how those stories just continue to just move. And our sacred stories, they teach us that the land is alive, right? These stories that my grandmother and my ancestors would tell me, that it holds not just the physical presence of our ancestors, but these stories, they hold our spirits of our ancestors. Our stories tell of kind of sometimes these ancient beings who walked this land long before us, how they shaped rivers or how they carved the hills and leaving the footprints in the earth. But these are not just tales of the past, they are living instructions of how to walk with respect, with humility, with a sense of responsibility for the land and everything within it, right? That I often think back to the night when I was older. I eventually kind of went back to visit my grandparents because eventually my mom and I and my older brother, we moved off the reservation into a small college town in South Dakota. And I was sitting on my grandparents' porch and once again, kind of after, life had been difficult and I had a lot of challenges growing up, I was so lost. I think it was just about, I was 16 years old at the time. And I was really unsure of kind of what was next. I was just having a hard time. And my grandfather, he had this just amazing, I remember sitting there and my grandfather came out and it was like the moonlight had hit just right. See, my grandfather, he had just this beautiful silver hair. And he always had a cowboy hat, and I always describe him as like, I age myself a little, but there's Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, right? Paul Newman, Robert Redford, for those of you who may know. But they would wear these little cowboy hats, and they kind of tilted them a little bit, like swagger before we even had that word, I think, right? That was my grandpa. And I remember that night he came out, and he was in his Wranglers and his boots, or actually, no, take that back. He always had holes in his socks, and he came out, and he had like his big toe was kind of hanging out, but the moonlight hit just right. And my grandfather had the most beautiful sparkling gray eyes. And I remember sitting there and he sat down beside me and he was carrying 2 mugs. And I remember looking at him thinking, wow, if there is somebody in your life that just is that person, that it's hard to put words to, that brings a smile to your face, the tears are usually happy for me. That was my grandpa. And he comes out with these 2 white mugs. And see, my job typically was the one to make coffee for him in the morning. And he taught me that if your spoon doesn't stand up in the coffee cup, it's not strong enough, right? That's why the ladies at church don't let me to make coffee. But this time he was bringing me tea, right? He was bringing me something to drink. And he told me to look up at the sky, and he said, Kelly, what do you see when you look out there? And I began to, sometimes I was just quite literal. So I started naming, like, ooh, look, the stars, the moon, look, there's horses, and the horses were kind of grazing in the distance, and I was being kind of naughty, and I'd say, and joking with him, I was like, and you could smell the manure, right? The night there was just this hint of manure from all the cows and the horses, but then you could smell that grass, right? It always felt like it was raining, it had rained, and then there was just that hint of what it smells like right after it rains. And you could just kind of smell the grass, right? That's what I could smell. And my grandfather pointed to the stars, and he said, each star is an ancestor watching over us. And he said, Wakanjeja, which means sacred child. He said, when you are alone, he says, you might be scared or you might be uncertain. Look to the night sky and know that you're not alone. That night, the Hanyawi, which is the moon, was really rising, right? And that lullaby of those creatures of the night, they just completely surrounded us. And those stars were my ancestors, and their light, it guided me during those dark moments. They were singing. It was just like they were singing to me, and they were comforting me, and they were reminding me that even in my loneliness, I was never truly alone. And I share this story with you and these stories because they're not just my stories. They're our stories. That we all have stories that bring us healing, that remind us of our place in the world. And that's something I think is really important, is to think is, what is your story that brings you healing? How do you find comfort in those difficult times? For me, it's the night sky and the moonlight, right? It just seems to just wrap around me like a blanket. And those stars and the whispers of just that wisdom and the stories of my people that my grandfather would tell, that remind me that I'm not alone. That our stories are sacred, but they are also living entities, just like the land itself. That in every breath of wind, every kind of ripple within the water, in every kind of rustle of the leaves, if you go stand out there today, that our ancestors, your ancestors, they're speaking. That if you listen, you will hear them. Even if you're not quite sure and you can't name who those ancestors are, that wisdom is held within you because they're already a part of who you are. That you are here today because of the resilience of the people of your family that came before you. And you carry those stories. And they're not static, right? These stories aren't static. They evolve every time we retell these stories. But their core truth always remains the same, and that is that we are all related, like we say, right? Mitakyue wasan, that these phrases, this prayer, it carries such profound meaning and reminds us that no person, no action, no element of creation stands alone, that we are connected to each other, to the animals, to the plants, and what we do to the land, we do to ourselves. And the trauma of colonization that has threatened these connections, the U.S. Dakota War in 1862 was not just a battle over land. It was really an assault on our identity, our way of life, our very existence of people. Did you know that during that time, after that war, everything about who we were as indigenous people became absolutely illegal? We couldn't speak our own language. We couldn't dress the way we wanted to dress. We couldn't practice our own beliefs. We couldn't pray the way we wanted to pray and live life the way we wanted to, because what happened was people just didn't take that time to understand the beautiful reality of who we were and are as indigenous people, right? that the doctrine of discovery, the policy that justified the theft of indigenous lands, it told the world that we were less than human. That our land, our lives, that our stories had no value. But we are still here. And our stories are still here. And the land remembers, and so do we. And that trauma of this disconnection, it happens all around the world today. Right? That healing for us, for me as an Indigenous person, is not just about overcoming trauma. It's about returning to that kind of sacred path, that it's about reconnecting to the land with my ancestors, with the teachings that have sustained us for generations. Healing is more than fixing what is broken. It is the kind of that journey about reconnecting with the sacredness around us. And at the heart of our way of being, in Lakota we have this kind of, it's an understanding. So in a lot of our words, our phrases, it starts with the word or the letters W-O, woe, right? And woe is more than just a word, it's more than just a phrase or a couple of words, letters. It's a sacred understanding that guides our place in the world. It's a call for us to live with intention, to recognize our responsibilities of the land and to each other and to all living things. When we see woe in any phrase or word, that tells us it's sacred and it's important and we need to just kind of sit up a little bit, right? Woe is not something we just simply speak because it is something we embody, that it calls us to live in balance. So to understand that every action we take, it ripples out into the world and it affects the land, the water, and the communities around us. And in Lakota, that woe precedes so many words of sacred action, and each one carries deep responsibility. So for example, we say wochikye, right? Which means to pray, but prayer in this sense is more than just this quiet thought or a private moment with God or Creator. Prayer is an active and living thing. When we pray, we participate in something that's so much larger than we are, right? That it connects us with God, the land, the ancestors, the universe. Wochikye is just this sacred action that it's in motion. So in everything that we do, woe reminds us of that interconnectedness, right? It calls us to live with that respect and humility and the sense of sacred duty. And to live according to that woe is to live in a way that honors the past, that acknowledges the present, that prepares a path for future generations. It's the foundation upon which we build our stories, our relationships, and our community. But even more importantly, woe is like that sacred action of justice to make sure that everyone's story is heard and respected, right? This moment in our storytelling, right, in our prayers and in our actions, when we practice that woe, it's this way of walking through the world with mindfulness and respect. It's knowing that our lives are not separate from the lives of all those around us. And every time we tell a story, we are weaving that past and that present and that future together. And we're connecting ourselves to everything around us and those yet to be born. Then it's through these kind of sacred actions that we heal not only ourselves, but we begin to heal our communities when we begin to live in that sacred action and that understanding that when we walk the path of woe, the path of sacred responsibility, your pain is my pain. My celebrations are your celebrations. It brings us into a whole new reality of what community means and is and how we live and act in the world. And community is the heart. It's at the heart of our stories. It's at the heart of our actions. It's at the heart of our identities. It's within the community that our stories are kept alive, that they're shared, that they're learned. And to be a good relative is to live by the stories of our people. In our communities, we learn that the values that guides our lives is a respect for all living things, generosity, humility, understanding that we are never alone. And as we gather today, I just want to urge each of you to think about your own connection to your land, to each other, to the stories that are shaping your life, and ask yourself, how do I honor the past while building a future that is just and that is whole? Or even better, what I ask my own students, I start my classes every semester. At the beginning, I ask, what does it mean to be human in the world? And I have them answer that, and then I come back at the end of the semester and have them ask it again, and it shifts. Right? That the answer lies in returning to the values that have always sustained us, that kinship, that community, that balance, and that respect, the respect. And I leave you kind of a bit with this thought that the past is not behind us, it's within us. It shapes us, it guides us, and it calls us to remember that we want to be able to commit today to listening deeply, to acting with intention, to weaving our shared histories in the fabric of our future. That together we're able to honor the sacred paths of our ancestors and create a world where every story is valued, every life is respected, and every community thrives in harmony with each other. That in those times when we can't exist because we can't agree, we can understand that we have been made to be community, so we work through it. We may not be able to convince somebody how you may believe and see the world, but you can listen. And you can allow that space to hear. So with that, I've been told we're going to have some time for some questions. I like cut out about 20 more minutes. I didn't know I had that much to talk about. The introverted people are the ones that speak the most, I think. But I would like to take some time. If people have thoughts or questions, I will do my best. I'm just going to give one little disclaimer, and I love, and this is oftentimes people don't have the opportunity to meet an Indigenous person as myself. Because of the strength and resilience of my family, I became the first Native woman theologian in a lot of denominations, which is a cool thing and kind of sad in some ways, right? But I will tell you, I do not know every Native person. So just know that. But I am grateful that if you've had the opportunity to meet somebody, I think that's absolutely wonderful. And if you meet any Native person in this area, ask them who they are, and they're going to share their story. So with that, go ahead and ask me a question. I'm going to take a drink while you do.
Well, thank you for your wonderful address today. As a Lakota woman and a Lutheran pastor, I loved your concept of the ancestors surrounding you. Do you think it's valid to relate that Lakota idea with like Hebrews 11, that we're surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses? Is that a valid equation?
I think so. I think one of the stories I often use is the story of Nathaniel, right? In that struggle and that uncertainty in the place in the world, right? And just as I think some of the stories that we learn in the Bible, right, that Jesus calls us to see beyond what is just on the surface, right, to recognize the potential in ourselves and in others. And and by doing so, it opens us up to the world and understanding who's just around us and how connected we are, and how those stories, because you think about how in Bible-wise, how Christ taught us in story. Christ never gave us the answer, but in those stories, like every time I go through something and I read and I listen, right? We learn through this. Those are the stories of our ancestors as well, right? That we see how Christ taught us to live our lives fully with our flaws and our fears and our strengths and our hopes, and so those stories alone are part of those ancestors. And
All right. Thank you so much. Let's give her a round of applause for it. Thank you. Appreciate it. Wonderful. we know from a university standpoint that classes are coming up and students are just itching to get there. So we're going to wrap up sort of the formal portion of today. Students, if you have questions for Dr. Sherman-Conroy, please feel free to come up and ask. There'll be food that you can grab on the way out. And again, we thank you so much for your presence here today, for your attendance. Have a wonderful, wonderful day.
Ooh, how was that?
So courses that you teach, do you teach the same course at different institutions, or do you teach different courses at different institutions?
So right now I'm teaching